In your system, you preserve market exchange whilst abolishing profit, wage dependence, and capital accumulation. Perhaps you could talk about this vision, which you draw inspiration for from Keynes and Beveridge, amongst others.
When many people hear about what I'm putting forward, they ask me whether my views have fundamentally changed in some way. And obviously they have. I'm now defending a role for markets in a world beyond capitalism. And you might ask, how did I come to this? Because I actually had to be dragged kicking and screaming towards this conclusion that markets have an important role to play. But now I'm quite comfortable with it, and I'm ready to defend the idea. I think that the thing about markets is that they are really good at helping us figure out what our options are and what our choices are when we have a limited amount of resources. So the idea is that you have a budget, you run a hospital and you have 10 million pounds, and you have all these things you can buy, and you have to figure out how to meet your different goals from that budget. Now, just in saying that, I'm already talking about markets rather differently than the way that economists do, because I'm saying that the thing about markets is that they help us organize decisions about how to meet many goals using many resources, not a single goal. And that many goals is really important because if you're running a hospital, you actually care about a lot of different things. You care about taking care of the patients. You also care about the morale and well-being of your workers. You care about the environmental consequences. Hospitals generate a lot of waste and so on. You might care about the quality of the food in the hospital, right? You care about all these different things, and you have to figure out how to balance those goals that you have with the resources you have. So I think markets in general, when we look at how households act, when we look at how nonprofit or public institutions act, when we look at how government budgets work, there's already a way in which markets are actually really useful for the kind of multidimensional judgment that we need to see in the future. They already help people organize decisions where there's limited resources and many different goals that they have to try to balance. The problem with markets really emerges when they structure our firms' decision making specifically around the goal of profit. So the idea here is to say the problem isn't really markets. The problem is an economy organized around profitability and specifically around profit-led investment. Because when it comes to firms, we can't say that, oh, the firm has many goals and it's using markets to figure out how to meet those goals with a limited budget. The goal of the firm in a capitalist society, and of course, private ownership is really important to this, the goal of the firm is to make as much money as possible, not to spend their budget across all their goals, but to ensure that as much of that budget is left over as possible, that financial surplus emerges and that it's as big as it can be, because that's going to be the source of income for the owners of the firm. That's like the part they take as a profit, and for the further investment of the firm. Either the firm's going to invest in expansion out of those resources, or it's going to use the fact that it can generate a profit to get loans from banks and stuff. The real problem with the system is not markets, it's this structure of profit-led investment, which makes all of our firms organize themselves ultimately around making money, around a profit. And the way you make a profit is by, as I said, producing this financial surplus. And the way you generate that financial surplus is by making sure that efficiency comes first in your decisions about what to do. Efficiency means that you're trying to organize things on the one hand to make your costs as low as possible, and the other hand, to make your revenues as high as possible. So minimizing costs and maximizing revenues, the gap between costs and revenues is where profit comes from. When not just owners of firms, but investors, when all these people are trying to figure out where to put their money, they're trying to figure out how to maximize that gap between costs and revenues at the lowest possible price. What's the cheapest investment that will give me the biggest return? And that ends up structuring our whole economy in a way that I call efficiency first. It's not that our economy can't consider other values. It's that in all decisions, efficiency has to be considered first among values. And that means that our economy forces all of these trade-offs that, we're not really able to intervene in or make. I'm not saying the whole system works this way. There's a number of caveats and exceptions. It's obviously really important that even when capitalists chase profits, that doesn't always generate efficiency in this beneficial sense that economists say. A lot of profits are captured through extraction, rent-seeking type of things that just move more income to the owners of the firm by taking away from society rather than growing the pie. There's also a really important role in that of monopolies or oligopolies that can temper their short-term search for profits in order to try to maintain market dominance in the service of long-term profits. And it's also really important that the economy that I'm talking about here is in the whole of society. Society has all these different goals. It's just that the economy makes it very hard to realize them in its core operations. And that's why when I talk about these things, I talk about also Keynes and Beveridge as having made a decisive intervention. Keynes was a complicated figure. He famously said that in the coming class war, you'd find him on the side of the educated bourgeoisie. He was certainly not an ally of the working class. He defended many bad ideas, and I'm not going to defend him as a whole and his thinking. But I think that he made some really decisive contributions that we have a lot to learn from. And I think that actually Keynes was much more, I want to say very carefully, he was much more of an anti-capitalist than he's given credit for. The thing that Keynes realized is that if investment in the private economy is generally structured around profit seeking, the thing about public investment is that it doesn't need to have that goal. When it comes to public investment, you can kind of think about the public as having this investment budget. They have a certain amount that they can spend without going beyond what's available in terms of real resources. So that's like aggregate investment. They have a certain amount that they can spend, and the public can invest with any number of goals. So, for example, his most famous intervention was this idea that we can take full employment itself as a goal of investment. We can invest not to make money, but just to ensure that all labor, everyone who wants a job is able to find one. But that was just a beginning of an insight into something much bigger, because William Beveridge comes around and says, hey, we don't only have to do this to seek full employment. We can use public investment to improve health outcomes, educational outcomes. We can build not just a welfare state in the sense of the NHS, but we can build a whole society where there's all of this public activity organized at improving people's lives as such, without needing to generate a profit to make that investment worthwhile. So they had this idea of what they called the socialization of investment. Keynes was talking about it a lot. Beveridge took up this idea. They said that we could transition to a public investment in the driver's seat economy where 2/3 or more of all investment was public, and the remaining portion of private investment, this was never done anywhere, but the remaining portion of private investment, the state would have veto power over those investment decisions. So the state would get to decide if a corporation wants to make an investment, whether or not that would go through or how those investments would be sequenced. If the state did that, they would gain control over that aggregate investment level, and they could ensure that it's always generates full employment, but also that public investment serves this larger variety of goals. Now, a big issue with this is that Keynes imagined this working in a world where they had pushed profit rates to zero through control over public investment, where interest rates had fallen to zero, and where therefore the capitalist had been negated as a figure. He thought there'd still be entrepreneurship, but not capitalism. I think that his way of thinking about it leaves a really big question about what kinds of dynamism there would still be in the system. He imagined stagnation as like the condition of this change, whereas I am imagining a post-capitalist future with a lot of dynamism. He doesn't really think about how to import these principles into firms themselves. He just sees it as structuring the investment system. So it raises this real question, like if all of these people at work have all this specialized knowledge and know-how to solve these big problems that can't be solved just by focusing on efficiency, how do we actually access all of that know-how and allow people to dynamically pursue many goals besides efficiency? He didn't really think about that problem. And then the really big problem with Keynes and Beveridge is that they were technocrats. They really were thinking about a system where all this would be run in a way that was really insulated from popular control. And that intersects with a big issue with Keynes that I mentioned a while ago, which is that he wasn't a friend of the working class, and he didn't really understand that there's no necessary or automatic way that wages are set. There's a big struggle between capital and labor over wages. He thought that in a world of full employment, you could produce this kind of harmony between the classes, not realizing that when you got to full employment, that would just be an opportunity for workers to leverage their power to push for deeper changes in the system. So his neglect of these kinds of deeper social, class, and political issues mean that we can't just take over his solutions, but we have a lot to learn from them, both about how to get out of a capitalist economy, but also more fundamentally, how to think about and imagine a world where investment is pried free from capitalist control and profit-based orientation and becomes this public thing where we have a certain budget for investment and we're deciding how to use that investment across all the different ways to improve society that are available to us.
You emphasize that conflict, disagreement, and value pluralism are permanent, irreducible features of a post-capitalist economy with multiple dimensions. Can you explain why this has to be the case and how this might be navigated in your system?
Once we take hold of the investment function of society, once we socialize investment and remove control of it from the hands of profit-seeking investors, we can really go anywhere as a society. We can do anything. It's this kind of incredible rocket ship that we would gain control over. Now, that's not, of course, adequate in itself. There's a lot of people working in this rocket ship. And so we'd have to make sure they're actually motivated and doing what they need and want to do. But the idea still stands that this is like the ship we can go anywhere with. And I think that many of us, especially on the left, would hope that we would use this rocket ship to do a set of things. We would want to make sure that everyone has enough to live, right? That there's this kind of widespread material security that everyone has access to. We want to make sure that we are building ecologically sustainable future for ourselves, right? That's a green transition that involves not just decarbonization, but a whole range of other changes that would be required to be ecologically sustainable. We would want to get to a world where people have a lot of personal autonomy, where they have a lot of control over their lives and how they go and the kind of decisions that structure them, but where there's also a lot more community than we have right now, right? That means building and restructuring all these public spaces and public services and transforming and making possible all of this human connection that's currently being undermined by forces in society that are generating loneliness, putting everyone addicted to their phones and social media. We want to overcome that. We want to build a world that repairs historical injustices, right? That really finally recognizes all the things that have gone wrong because of capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, racism, sexism, and so on. We want to devote resources to repairing those historical harms rather than pretending they don't exist. We want to make work quality good. Like the list goes on and on and on of all these things that we're going to want to do once we gain control over the investment function. 3 problems arise. The first one is that we're going to disagree about which goals matter, right? We're going to disagree about when we list all the goals we want, we're going to disagree about how they matter. We're going to disagree about what these goals mean, even when we agree on them. So we might all agree that we need ecological sustainability, but we might really disagree on what that entails. Some people are going to be vegans, are going to imagine we go toward a vegan world, some not. There's different ways to imagine the kinds of energy demand we will have and how we should meet that. They're going to shape kinds of life possibilities. And when you go through all of these different aspects of every goal, there's so many different ways to imagine realizing them. And then the third issue is kind of the meta goal question, which is what are our priorities? We have a limited amount of resources that we can use for investment. How are we going to prioritize across our goals? And it's a big deal because nothing says that if we pursue our goals in one order, we will arrive at the same end place as if we pursue them in a different order. There's a kind of path dependence in whatever path we take in this multidimensional progress. So for all those reasons, we can't agree on what the goals are. We can't agree on what it specifically means to operationalize those goals and measure progress towards them. And we can't agree on how to prioritize across those goals. What all of that means is that we can have a much better world. We can have a world that pursues all the different goals that matter to us, but it will always be a particular world. It will always concretely embody those values in a specific way. And that specific way will make it easier to live certain kinds of lives and harder to live others. And it will embody values that some people have very directly and other people will disagree with or have differently. And that is not a reason to despair. Actually, you wouldn't want to live in a world which is just the result of some individual or some group imposing their views about all of that stuff on the rest of us. We want to live in a dynamic world that's not only dynamic technologically, but also in a value sense. We want to live in a world where, pushing in a certain direction, if that direction turns out to be wrong or generate unexpected or unanticipated or anticipated harms, we want to live in a world where we can change course and revise our direction where we're going, and where that dynamic and like concrete way that we're meeting all of our goals is changing with debates and conflicts and new ideas and structures in society. I think it's really important to recognize that it's not only that we have values and that our values conflict with one another. Even inside each of us, we have values that conflict. The conflicts go all the way down. They're inside of communities, inside of individuals. And that's something that's just really important to take on. And it's actually a benefit, not a harm, to actually allow those conflicts both within ourselves and between people and between societies to surface and have some form of resolution. It only becomes a problem if we don't have institutions that help us do that in a legitimate way, that help us surface our conflicts and then select among our different options in a way that, brings people together, brings people back together. And so a lot of what I'm interested in is to really think about what those institutions might look like. I've done some work explaining where possible ways that we could organize those institutions, but I think it's going to have to be a really big debate in society. This can involve a lot more people and also a lot of experimentation to figure out how we can live together and how we can make our conflicts productive. As much as it would be nice to imagine a world of harmony, I think that actually, one feature about utopian and sci-fi kind of ideas in the past is that people quickly realize that what could be a utopia for some is a dystopia for others, right? Like dystopia isn't the opposite of utopia. In many cases, it's the realization of someone else's utopia that is the dystopia. And so we want to live in a world where we have conflict and those conflicts are productive and where we can grow, basically where we can grow as individuals and we can grow as societies and change. We can change our values, invent new values, and we have spaces where we can debate about it. The thing about capitalism is that because it's structured around efficiency, income growth, GDP growth, it can't even allow us to really have those debates. There's a really strong conflict between how our economy is organized and the real democracy that allow us to really consider our values and decide how we want to change the world, that would allow us to consider our values and how we want to change the world. And what we need to do is get out of capitalism so that we can actually have these productive debates and really begin to grow and mature as human beings and as societies in ways that capitalism doesn't really allow us to achieve.